A lot of this debate has to do with the invasion of Iraq, and I won't be saying much about that. While I have my opinions, I don't feel like I have enough knowledge about it to make arguments to back up those opinions, which are as strong as I would like. Rather, I'll focus on the arguments about religion. Hitchens starts by saying that the strongest arguments for a God whose existence is necessary for the creation of the universe don't come anywhere near the state of being evidence for an Abrahamic God who doesn't want you to fap.
To go from being a deist to a theist, in other words, from someone who says, God cares about you, knows who you are, minds what you do, answers your prayers, cares which bits of your penis or clitoris you saw away or have sawn away for you, minds who you go to bed with and in what way, minds what holy days you observe, minds what you eat, minds what positions you use for pleasure. All your work is still ahead of you, and lots of luck. Because there's nobody, even Aquinas had to give it up. There's no one who can move from the first position to the second.
Apologists often say that atheism is motivated by a desire to reject a God's authority so we can make our own decisions and run our own lives. This is silly, of course, because it would be fallacious to think that denying the existence of authority is an effective way to avoid its power. However, apologists talk about wanting to run one's own life instead of living a life of obedience as though it is some horrible, selfish vice. They think servility to authority is more virtuous than independence. Peter Hitchens seems to think that people are incapable of governing themselves.
All this seems to me to point to an important factor in religion, which is why it seems to me that it is reasonable, given that we are ignorant of the answer as to whether there is or is not a God and cannot know, why we might reasonably think that it was worth believing in such a being. If the universe does have an order, if it does have an origin, if there is running through it an eternal law, then wouldn't it be a good idea to try to find out what it was and to seek to govern ourselves by it?
Well, that would depend entirely on what that law says. Peter seems to think that the mere existence of such a law obligates us to follow it, or that following such a law would automatically be beneficial.
Now, I too have been to North Korea, and I will tell you that I have the opposite impressions to that which my brother had. This is a country entirely run by people who hate and despise the idea of God and who have made themselves into gods. And that, indeed, is what so very often happens when people ignore the very, very earliest part of the Bible, in which the serpent says to Adam and Eve, "Eat of this fruit, and ye shall be as gods." This is what we do when we decide for ourselves that there is nothing above us. We destroy authority. We destroy all the things which turn the hearts of the disobedient to the wisdom of the just.
So remember, kids, the moral of the story is never try to think for yourself. Defer to a book written thousands of years ago because we could never hope to improve upon the moral sensibilities of the Bronze Age.
But to say, I'll take your sins away, you never committed them. You're washed white as snow and clean as new. And you can watch me being tortured and put to death as a lamb, as a sheep. And I'll call you a sheep, and my congregation will be called a flock. From then on is a double humiliation. First, it's a hideous outrage on the scapegoat. Second, it's a terrible insult on those who agree to be called sheep. Anyone here want to stand up and say, I'm a sheep? I'm a lamb? Yes. Good for you. Anyone else? Good for the rest of you. Fine. Sheep you are.
One of the lessons of the Bible is that servility and obedience are virtues for some reason. A strong example of this is the story of Abraham and Isaac.
But to mock them as if they were a matter of a man sticking a knife towards his son's throat with the idea that this was a recommended action in the manual of life is not merely a misunderstanding, it's falsehood.
Christopher never said that the point of that story was that one ought to actually sacrifice one's child. The point of the story is that one ought to be so obedient to a God that one is willing to put a knife to the throat of one's child. One ought to be that servile and pathetic.
When it does produce good characteristics, in the book you will find that those who are Christians who do good things are recruited to the atheist cause. No, they didn't do it because they were Christians, they did it because they were something else. And if societies do anything bad, then the Stalinist state of the Soviet Union is said to have done those things because Stalinist communism was in fact a form of religion. You can't win. It's completely secular. There is nothing that anybody can do which is religious and which is based on a belief in God, which Christopher will think is right, and if anybody does anything which is wrong, then it will be God's fault.
No, the point is not that it's a God's fault. The point is that it is the fault of insufficient skepticism. Here's my favorite part of the debate, because Christopher Hitchens takes a giant shit all over the idea that atheist dictatorships were violent because they were atheist.
Atheism will kill without any limit if it gets into power anywhere. This has been proved from one end of the world to another. After Ethiopia, wait, this is your
Sir, I
thing.
need you to wrap up the
Atheism will
question.
kill. There is no defense.
Sir, we need a, excuse me,
The
sir,
question is
sir,
whether-
we need a question, please.
question-
No,
is
he's got made a perfectly good question.
It's, how can you defend atheism? I mean, how can there be, you say that atheism won't kill? I mean, if you bring atheism back in a government, it will kill as many people.
One of the least religious countries in the world is Sweden. Is the Swedish government marching priests off to gas chambers? The Japanese have fewer theists per capita than most Western countries, and they barely even have a military.
No, the question of, by the way, I thought it was a perfectly well-phrased question. To be an atheist doesn't guarantee you against being a sadist or a nihilist or a fascist or a Stalinist or a Maoist, though it's slightly unlikely I think you'd be a fascist or a National Socialist, but it's I would say, a necessary condition for enlightenment, not a sufficient one. And I'll take your question seriously in the following way. The 20th century totalitarianisms that are accused of being secular, I'll say something about each of them. It was a long question, so I hope you'll allow me. I'll try and condense it. To start with the original 20th century totalitarian ideology, which originally called itself fascism. If in any account you read of fascism, historical account you read, from its origins in Italy, through Spain, Portugal, Croatia, Hungary, Slovakia, etc. If you take out the word fascist and put Catholic right wing, it's the same story. There's no difference. And if you add parties in political alliance with the Vatican, it's the same. All of them. Fascism is another word for the Christian Catholic right wing. In Slovakia, the actual head of the fascist dictatorship was a priest, Father Tiso. In almost every case, the regime was in holy orders and or with the direct alliance with the Pope himself. That's a simple matter. Anyone can check it out. I'm not going to assert it now. I would just say fact-checking, and I would be as one on this point. Now, that's not completely true with National Socialism. It's true of the Nazi Party in Austria and Bavaria in its heartlands that it begins blessed by the Vatican, by a concordat with the Church, by the Protestant churches also. But it's not true to say it's a Christian movement in quite the same way. It's a pagan movement to some extent. My favorite example is this, I suppose. Joseph Goebbels was expelled from the Catholic Church. He was. He was the only Nazi who was. Why was he expelled? For marrying a divorced Protestant. Magda Goebbels. You see, the church does have its standards. However, it is estimated by Paul Johnson, Catholic historian, that more than 40% of the Waffen-SS were practicing, confessing Catholics. No one was ever excommunicated or threatened with excommunication for taking part in the final solution. And that was because of the alliance between the Nazi Party and the Church on two main things, anti-Bolshevism and anti-Semitism. Again, I'm condensing a bit. Now, it brings me to the Stalinists. Okay, you're Joseph Stalin. You've taken over Russia. You've been educated in a seminary in Georgia, by the way. Up till 1917, for hundreds of years, hundreds of millions of Russians have been told that the head of the state is a god, that the Tsar is above power, ordinary secular power, that he's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church as well as the... You shouldn't be in the dictatorship business if you can't take advantage of a deep well of credulity and servility like that. It's your golden opportunity. What does he do? Heresy trials. Heresy trials, witch hunts. Miraculous discoveries such as Lysenko's biology. the worship of the leader from whom all blessings flow. As I described North Korea, the most religious state I've ever seen. Mutatis mutandis, this would apply also to Mao's China, with the same background of superstition and servility. Now, for there to be a fair test about this, you'd have to do the following. And no one I've ever debated with has even tried it, so you be the first. You find me a state or a society that threw off theocracy and threw off religion and said we adopt the teachings of Lucretius and Democritus and Galileo and Spinoza and Darwin and Russell and Jefferson and Thomas Paine. And we make those what we teach our children. We make that scientific and rational humanism our teaching. And you find me that state that did that and fell into tyranny and slavery and famine and torture, and then we'll be on a level playing field. As it is, all you've done is show that the idea of worship and the idea of credulity and the idea of servility and slavery to religion is a bad idea in the first place.
Whenever we speak of any dictatorship, be it atheist or theist, the problem is always the same, which is insufficient civic skepticism. By civic skepticism, I mean valuing the freedom to publicly question and challenge any idea. No dictatorship could ever survive if it were based on valuing such a thing.
The Russians never killed 30% of the population before the communists took over, 20 or 30%. No czar ever did that. No Christian czar ever did any killing on anyone.
Well, no, excuse me, they started the First World War, they started the pogroms, they brought the protocols of the Elders of Zion that was imported by Tsarist secret policemen to National Socialist Christian gangsters in Europe. How much do you think the export of Russian Orthodox anti-Semitism cost us in point of lives and war? And have you ever counted up what happened to the wars in the wars that Tsarism started and carried on, and the persecutions, and the famines, and the tortures, and the starvation, and the people who just died of neglect? Come on. You want to do this accounting? I'm here. I'm really here for you. Or what the Serbian Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox have just done in the Balkans. The most recent genocide we've seen in Europe, entirely done by Russian and Serbian Orthodox fascists and Catholic Croatian Ustasha, grinding a whole part of civilized Europe into nothingness and bloodshed for their filthy, stupid medieval quarrels. How dare you say that any secularist, we who've opposed this kind of barbaric stuff, are on all fours with these creeps? You should take it back. You owe me an apology.
It's hard to follow that, but Peter tries.
I've conceded the evils done by my side. Why can't you just simply accept that the Soviet Union was an atheist regime which hated God? Why can't you do that?
Because it would be false, because the Russian Orthodox Church stood then, as it did with Stalin, as it now increasingly does. Black-cowled figures appear next to Vladimir Putin, former current KGB thug, tyrannizer of the Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltics, filthy replacement of Tsarism, filthy synthesis of Stalinism and Tsarism. The same Russian Orthodoxy is his official nationalist and statist ideology. There was never a moment in Russian history where the powers that be didn't find that church convenient. It may not have been convenient for you as a believer to notice it, but I am obliged to the truth in the matter. Russia was not an atheist state. It wasn't even a secular state. It was a pseudo-religious state borrowing from the practice of orthodoxy and trading upon its teachings and its tradition.